Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. When he had come near Bethphage and Bethany, at the place called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it.'" So those who were sent departed and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" And they said, "The Lord needs it." Then they brought it to Jesus. And after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. And he rode along. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. Now, as he was approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." Jesus went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial."
Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. When they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. Then a female servant, seeing him in the firelight, stared at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I don't know him." A little later, someone else, on seeing him, said, "You also are one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." About an hour later, still another kept insisting, "Surely this man was with him, for he's a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And at that moment, when he was still speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. And then Peter remembered the word of the Lord and how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
So 9 years ago, last time I was preaching in a church regularly, I did a sermon series during Lent that was on the last week in the life of Jesus. And so about the third Sunday in Lent, I preached on Jesus going to Gethsemane. And incidentally, Gethsemane is not mentioned in this passage, but I'll talk about that later. But it was Jesus praying in Gethsemane. And so then a few weeks passed and we had Easter. And one of my church members, Mark, came up to me after Easter Sunday and said, "John, I really liked that sermon you preached a few weeks ago, you know, when Jesus went to Yosemite." And I couldn't laugh in his face, of course. So I said, I think you mean Gethsemane. Oh, yes, Gethsemane. But it did plant a seed that maybe one day I'll do a sermon series on Jesus visits the national parks. So we've got a lot of text today. We're covering a lot of ground. I'm trying to think about ways to tie all this together. I'm remembering something I read many years ago. It was either from John Dominic Crowson or Marcus Borg. Those may be names that are familiar to you. They were kind of big in the 1990s, early 2000s, historical Jesus research, wrote a lot of material for progressive churches. And they had some things to say about this story, especially the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, which is where we started. And so I thought, well, what is a good way of kind of bringing all that together so that it makes sense? So we start with the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And then I remembered this. It's that announcer that does the boxing matches, and he starts it off like this. "Let's get ready to rumble!" Y'all heard that? Yeah. All right, so we got, in this corner, Jesus of Nazareth, who comes to us from a life of healing the sick, feeding the hungry, giving sight to the blind, good news to the oppressed, who talks about a coming kingdom, who talks about loving others, loving neighbors, loving enemies, who has been selfless and teaching his disciples to do the same. Here he comes. Let's see who's in his entourage. Because all boxers have entourages. And so it looks like he's got some regular folk and cloaks. People are putting cloaks in front of him. There are no palm branches in Luke. It's all cloaks. But anyway, they're putting cloaks down in front of him. And what's he riding? He's riding a donkey. All right. So there comes one contender. In this corner, we have Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate comes to us from a life of self-promotion, kissing up to Caesar, probably a member of the emperor cult who worships Caesar, who lauds his power over others, and who, in fact, every year at Passover, at the beginning of Passover, rides in a parade into Jerusalem to show off his power. And so Crowson and Borg, I think, both believe that these two things are happening at the same time. Now let's look at Pilate's entourage. What does Pilate got? Pilate's got soldiers, chariots, and war horses. So Pilate's riding in from this side of town, this corner of the ring. Jesus is riding in from this side of town, this corner of the ring. And it is believed that the gospel writers are telling this story in part as commentary about this story. And here they come, and they're going to have a clash. I wonder who's going to win between Pilate and Jesus. And then I think about, just the minutes before a match, a boxer's in the locker room, and I imagine that they're going through all kinds of things to psych themselves up, and they may even be praying. And we've got the story of Jesus at the Mount of Olives. Now, in the other Gospels, it's Gethsemane or the garden. Luke mentions neither. For Luke, it just happens at the Mount of Olives. And so Jesus is praying. And he knows what's about to happen, and he's praying for strength to get through it. And I've told you before how the gospel writers are more like portrait painters than they are like documentarians. They're not taking photographs. They're not telling us, and then Jesus did this, and then Jesus did that. They're painting a portrait. And they're very artistic. And you can kind of see some of the artistry in this story in the Mount of Olives. when in seminary you study all kinds of ways of reading the Bible, and one of those ways is literary critical. And so one of the things that those scholars have noticed is that sometimes the artistry of the author comes out in what they call chiastic structure, which we're taught to think of it as a sandwich. And so the stories are kind of repetitious and reflective. And so if you read what happens in the Mount of Olives, the story breaks down like this. Jesus tells the disciples to pray that they do not enter into the time of trial. That's the first piece of bread in the sandwich. Do not enter into the time of trial. Then Jesus withdraws from the disciples, kneels, prays. And he prays this prayer, not my will, but your will, God. And he prays for the cup of suffering to pass from him. Now, unfortunately, and I hate to bring the bad news, the great sweat drops of blood is a later addition and not found in the earliest manuscripts. But it is a profound image. So anyway, back to this sandwich, this chiastic structure. Jesus prayed that you not enter into time of trial, withdraws, kneels, prays, and then does the reverse. Rises, rejoins, tells the disciples, pray that you don't enter into the time of trial. So the two prayers about trial are the bread of the sandwich, and everything else reflects each other in the middle. So it shows artistry in the telling of the story. That's one of the ways they know that things have been inserted later, because it violates that structure. But Jesus is in the garden, or on the Mount of Olives, praying this prayer. And he begins it and ends it, telling the disciples to pray that they do not enter into a time of trial, which prepares us for the next section. Because in the next section, Jesus is undergoing trial, and Peter undergoes a trial. And Peter is accused of knowing Jesus, and we get the famous denials, the 3 denials of Peter. And all my life, I've just been so judgmental of Peter. So easy. But it's also been easy to be a Christian. All my life, it's asked nothing of me. I'd be a Christian easily. Not so much anymore. Suddenly, the temptation of denial is becoming more and more real. To be tempted to deny Jesus. What might that look like today? Well, it might look like, hey, I saw you with those illegals. Was that you? Helping them? Not me. Not me. That's denying Jesus. Or, I saw you standing up for trans people. Was that you? Oh, no, no, no. That's denying Jesus. Or, did I see you at the protest? Was that you? Oh, no, no. All of these things feel more real now, don't they? And so the temptation of denial becomes stronger and stronger because the cost of being a follower is getting heavier and heavier. So I can relate with Peter. Peter's life is on the line. So I don't judge Peter anymore. I understand Peter. And that's kind of small D denial. I also think of big D denial. When I was a chaplain at Emory Hospital, we spent a lot of time talking amongst the chaplains about what is the difference between hope and denial. And it's not as easy as you might think. When a family is there and the doctors throw out some kind of far-fetched, possible way of curing their relative, do we participate in something that is giving false hope? Or do we prepare the family to accept what's coming? What is the difference? And it's not always easy to know. And so that's one thing I invite you to think about over this Holy Week, is how do you think of the difference between hope and denial? But we've got Jesus and we've got Pilate coming in for this clash. I wonder who's going to win. In my mind, Pilate represents pleasure without conscience. Doing whatever he wants without concern for others. And Jesus represents the power of conscience. I wonder who wins between pleasure and conscience.
When the day came the chief priests and the scribes gathered together, and they brought him to the council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer." Then they rose and brought Jesus to Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man inciting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." When Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man," but they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." They all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us!" This was a man who had been put into prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city, and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why, what evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished.
So what kind of person is Pilate? Historically speaking, Pilate was brutal. He is somebody who rose to power, kissing up to the emperor, who was responsible for thousands and thousands of crucifixions, and did not care. This is the person who, on the Jewish Passover, decided that was the time to ride into town and show his power and his might, as a way of reminding the Jewish people that this may be your celebration, but I'm the one in control. So he's not afraid to use his power. He's not afraid to lord it over others. And he certainly isn't bothered by executing people. Now it's interesting that in the Gospels, Pilate gets treated softer than he should. In the Gospels, it's presented to us as though Pilate's like, "Oh, Jesus is innocent. I don't want to do this." And it's the crowd and it's the religious leaders that insist. Now, I think that's late first century, early Christians telling the story a certain way. Chances are, historically, Pilate never knew who Jesus was. Didn't talk to him, didn't care. Pilate crucified thousands of people like Jesus all the time. Did not take the time to interview each one of them individually. But we've got this, this dramatic creation in the Gospels. And in these stories, Pilate is kind of seen as, he's innocent. remember that these Gospels are written between 65 and 100. And during that time period, there are 2 persecutions against Christians by Rome. And so in writing their stories, the Gospel writers may not have wanted to antagonize Rome unnecessarily. So they give Pilate a pass. And instead they put the blame on the religious leaders and the crowd. And you have to think about what's going on at the time of the early church, when the early Christians are coming together with these Gospels. You've got the Roman Empire, the dominant force. You've got the Jewish community that is oppressed and occupied. But then you've got, below the Jewish community, you've got fledgling Christians who experience persecution even from the Jewish community. And so they're telling their stories about what happened to Jesus, and it might make sense for them to say, we don't want to blame Rome, let's blame the Jewish religious leaders. And that might have been harmless in the first century. But then time passed, and Rome went away, and now we have Christendom. And so there's Christendom, and there's the Jewish community. And there's still this lingering story about how they're the ones to blame for the crucifixion of Jesus. So what started off as kind of an understandable, harmless little story told by a few fledgling Christians has turned into the justification for genocide and anti-Semitism. Because the context changed. And you can see this happening in the Gospels. If you read Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the synoptics, the earlier Gospels, the enemies of Jesus are primarily scribes, Pharisees, chief priests, temple authorities. But when you get to the Gospel of John, that is the latest, the enemies of Jesus are usually named as the Jews. And so you can see it developing already in those first decades. And so in our stories, Pilate is kind of treated better than he deserves. Because we know from other sources what kind of person Pilate was. Pilate was the kind of leader who rubbed it in people's faces, who was arrogant and self-promoting. We don't know anybody like that in our world. And so this is the power, and I equate that somewhat with pleasure without conscience. Because then we've got Jesus. And they have this conversation. It is, are you the king of the Jews? Are you the Messiah? And we have to remember that Jesus is a disappointing Messiah. Because the people who were looking for a Messiah weren't wanting one to come in on a donkey. They were wanting one to come in on a horse. They weren't wanting somebody who would come in humble and willing to suffer. They wanted somebody to kick butt. And what they got was Jesus. And so Jesus was a disappointing Messiah. And that's one of the things that early Christians had to deal with. And it comes out in these conversations in the Gospels. What kind of king are you? And Jesus kind of is coy with his answers. And then we come to this very bizarre story about Barabbas. I don't know what to make of this. Jesus is swapped because the people demand that he release Barabbas, somebody who has been convicted of sedition and murder. Jesus is accused of sedition. Pilate thinks Jesus is innocent. Barabbas is guilty. Pilate's going to make this swap. That makes no sense. Historically, didn't happen. There's no evidence that Pilate ever did this kind of thing. But I wonder if the writers of the Gospels aren't doing something else creative with us. Because the name Barabbas means it's Bar Abba, son of the Father. And even there is tradition, or maybe in another gospel here, his first name is Jesus. Jesus, son of the Father, is traded for Jesus, son of the Father. And so maybe there's something going on here that we don't know, that we can't decipher. But it sure is curious. But again, Pilate and Jesus, we had this confrontation with power and conscience. And I do wonder which side is going to win.
As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country. And they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right, one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." One of the criminals who was handed over there kept deriding Jesus and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? For we have indeed been condemned justly, and we're getting what we deserved. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
So when you're a preacher, you're asked along the way to kind of identify what is your biblical character that you identify with. And a lot of preachers identify with, Moses and Mary and Ruth and David and Martha and all those kinds of people. And I have to be honest and tell you that for me, it's Simon of Cyrene. I identify with Simon of Cyrene, who is just minding his own business in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and he's suddenly compelled to carry Jesus' cross. He didn't choose it, it was just given to him. I was born into a Southern Baptist family. And I've had this cross put on me, and I have tried to get rid of it on numerous times. Because the power of conscience is heavy. It'd be so much fun to just pursue the pleasure and not the conscience. And I've tried to shake it, and I've tried to shake it, and I can't seem to shake it. And so here I stand before you, a minister weighed down. As I agree with Simon of Cyrene, I get Simon of Cyrene. Interesting to note, Simon of Cyrene is not in the Gospel of John, because in the Gospel of John, Jesus is like Superman. And in John, it says he carried his own cross. In the Synoptics, Jesus needs help, because the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are more comfortable with Jesus being a vulnerable human being. So I like Simon of Cyrene in that way. I relate with Simon. They get to the place of the crucifixion. Jesus prays, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." That, to me, is a very profound prayer. And it only became profound when I started interpreting it differently than how I was raised. I was raised to believe that Jesus was praying, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know who they're crucifying." And instead, I think maybe it's just a general truth. Father, forgive us all. We don't know what we're doing. Because if you look at the crucifixion scene, everybody there thinks they're doing the right thing. The Romans think they're executing a traitor. Well, that's what most governments do. Most governments think that's the right thing to do. The religious leaders, to the degree that they've turned Jesus over, do so because they think they are protecting their own people. Because if these messianic people come up and lead revolutions, Rome's going to come in and slaughter thousands. And that does happen. So turning Jesus over is a way of caring for the people. And the soldiers who are guarding, those who are putting the nails into the hands of all of those crucified, they're following orders. Everybody thinks they're doing the right thing, and yet innocence is suffering. And to me, that is a profound awareness that our guiding prayer should always be, "Father, forgive us. We don't know what we're doing." And we are aware that we participate in the suffering of others. And help us. And then we get these 2 criminals, one on each side. And it's so Luke, I got to tell you. In Luke, one of the criminals rebukes Jesus, reviles him, mocks him, and the other one defends Jesus. This is also a difference. In Matthew and Mark, both of them, in fact, Mark says it explicitly, both reviled him. But in Luke, one doesn't. Because think about Luke's gospel. It is a gospel for the poor, the outcast, the downtrodden, the oppressed, the criminal. So of course in Luke, one of them gets it. And so you have an act of conscience, even on the cross. You have an act of conscience in Jesus' prayer. You have an act of conscience in this criminal. Even in the midst of this horrific death and this horrific exercise of raw power.
It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the morning, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last.
So Jesus is dead. Jesus is dead. And it looks to me like power has defeated conscience. And so we have to decide something. If you looked at things the way they were back then, it looked like all the world, that Pilate had defeated Jesus, that power had defeated conscience. But then time passed. And this Jesus kept having this effect on people and kept showing up and kept appearing. And so over time it flipped, and now it looks as though Jesus has defeated Pilate. But time passes. And now we're today. And it sure looks like power is back in control. So we have to decide to be agents of hope rather than agents of denial. I think denial always sides with pleasure. I don't want to be bothered. I want to be comfortable. Conscience sides with justice. Conscience sides with the gospel. Conscience sides with Jesus all the way to a cross. And what I love about the last words of Jesus is they don't come with denial. They don't even come with certainty. They come with, I have done everything I can do. I have laid my life down. And so, God, I commend my soul to you. What else should we ask of ourselves than to do all we can, to resist in the ways that we can, to stand in solidarity in the ways that we can, and understand that power is going to keep coming, but be agents of conscience. Because then we can say with Jesus, God, into your hands we commend our spirits. Into your hands we commend our efforts and our lives. What else is faith but commending ourselves into God's hands?